Let's hop right into our frugal weeknight meal. So first up on the menu is a very simple egg roll in a bowl. A recipe like egg roll in a bowl is super easy, and it really underscores how important it is for both frugality and efficiency to rely on simple ingredients and to batch prep your meals and ingredients. Simple ingredients like cabbage, for example, are inexpensive and versatile, while batch prepping makes the whole week easier. I'm going to chop up one more onion for the next recipe. Now I'm making these in one day. If you are making them in 2 days, you can still do that, because if you chop this now and keep it in the fridge, then tomorrow part of the work is already done for you. Anytime you can chop stuff in advance, it is worth the time. But the other part of this is I just don't like running back and forth between the stove and the cutting board, the stove and the cutting board. So on a busy weeknight, I really recommend chopping everything before you get started. Of course, over the entire meal, it's the same amount of cutting, but it does feel a little bit easier when the chopping is done first. Usually when I see an egg roll in a bowl recipe, it calls for ground beef, but I'm actually going to use ground pork because at my local grocery store, this was half the price of a pound of ground beef. I've actually been switching out a lot of my recipes to pork lately because beef and especially chicken breast are really expensive. So I get a much better bang for my buck with ground pork, but I definitely recommend using whatever ground meat you have on hand or whatever you can find at a good deal at your local grocery store. I just saw yesterday that the average price for ground beef right now in March 2025 is about $7.25 per pound, which is a lot. But I got this ground pork, I think it was $3.50 a pound, so that is significantly cheaper. But no matter what you're using, the first step here is to just brown the meat in the skillet. And this is a one skillet meal, so it will be easy cleanup too. And I actually forgot to shred the carrots for this, so while this is browning, I'm gonna shred the carrots really quickly. So much of that whole prepping in advance thing. Skillet meals like this really lend themselves to frugal weeknight dinners for a number of reasons. For frugality, they often are helpful because they feature fewer ingredients and they feature simple ingredients, and simple ingredients tend to be cheaper. But on top of that, they tend to highlight vegetables and often healthier ingredients. And when we put healthier, more nutritious food in our meals, it keeps us fuller longer. So it's a better bang for your buck when it comes to your groceries and what you are eating. And on top of that, they're just really easy to make and really easy to clean up. The process for a skillet meal is almost always the same. Cook your meat, add some onions, season it, throw in your veggies. And it can be like that for any type of skillet meal that you're making. Here, I'm just using some salt, pepper, ginger, and toasted sesame oil. So a lot of times for meals that are for busy nights, there's a recommendation to use like pre-shredded carrots, or in this case, a bag coleslaw. I actually recommend, for the sake of frugality, to shred your own carrots and to shred your own cabbage. So I got a giant, beautiful cabbage, about 4 times the weight of what I would get in a bag of coleslaw for less than half the price. So it is a much better deal to chop your own cabbage. Now, I know on a busy weeknight, you might not want to chop a cabbage, so that's what a Sunday prep is for. I have a lot of Sunday prep videos that I'll link below, but chopping that cabbage on a Sunday so that way you can throw it in your meals throughout the week makes it so much easier. So here I am just tossing in that shredded carrot, and then I'm also putting in the cabbage that I chopped up. And that was only about a third of the cabbage, so I have plenty more cabbage in the fridge to use, probably for this recipe again. My husband really liked this. I'll probably make it for dinner again later this week, but also for something like homemade sauerkraut, which is another really great thing to make yourself. It costs almost nothing to make homemade sauerkraut, but it's a little expensive at the store sometimes, especially if you want the good stuff. I let the cabbage sweat it out for about 5 minutes or so in the skillet, and once it was tender, I'm just adding in a number of different spices and sauces to make some sort of egg roll type flavor. What I really recommend here is using what you have on hand. Things get really expensive when we start buying different types of sauces and vinegars and seasonings just for one type of recipe. So stick with your pantry staples. this recipe, like the others in this video, take about 30 minutes. Now, they took me a little bit longer because filming really slows me down, but I am really confident that you could make this in probably closer to 20 minutes, especially if you chop up all of your veggies, maybe on a Sunday reset or in advance. But it is so easy and so delicious. Okay, next up is a vegetarian enchilada skillet meal. So for this, we are just cutting out the protein because we're going to use beans instead. And beans are always a really great way to reduce the cost of things. And I'll show you in just a minute how I even keep that cheaper. But for now, let's just get this going. I have the oven preheated to 400 and let's start cooking up the rest of these onions. Here's a fun fact for you. I used to be a vegetarian. When my husband and I met many years ago, about 10 years ago, I was a strict vegetarian, but I am no longer a vegetarian. I make meat all of the time. But the thing about vegetarian meals is often, depending on what you put in them, they are cheaper and faster to make because you don't have to take the time to make the protein. Those veggies cook really quickly. I'm going to throw a can of this enchilada sauce into the skillet. Now, I don't know if this is the most frugal ingredient because it's pre-made, but I don't have all the ingredients that I need to make this, and spices can be a little bit expensive. And on top of that, I am trying to strike a balance between getting things done quickly and efficiently for a weeknight meal, but also frugally. So right now, this was the cheapest one I could get of decent quality at my grocery store, so this is what I'm using. But if you have the ingredients and a good recipe, you can definitely make your own. And then I'm throwing in this bag of black beans. So you can definitely use canned black beans, but a really great way to save money on beans is to buy bags of dry beans. I actually got really big bags of dry beans at Sam's Club for a great price. And then what I do is I make big batches of them in the Instant Pot, and then I pre-bag them and freeze them. So it really costs like pennies to make beans this way, and they're just as convenient as canned beans because all I'm going to do is obviously pull it out of the freezer, and then I'm just gonna dump it right into the skillet. When I bag up those beans, I put about a cup to a cup and a half of beans per bag just for reference. So once that onion is sauteed and I have the sauce in there, I'm just throwing in those frozen beans and some frozen corn. Now, frozen corn I don't think is actually the cheapest way to make this, but I am always trying to strike a balance between frugality and efficiency, and making corn and shucking it, that's just not on the agenda for a weeknight at all. But after that, I'm just adding in some seasonings. Again, use what you have on hand. I'm using cumin and chili powder. Maybe you have taco seasoning, whatever it is you have, throw it in there. Just make sure it matches the other flavors. Now I am simply slicing up some tortillas. Preferably, I would like to use homemade tortillas, but I tend to not make them too often. And my husband bought these at Sam's Club, so we are using those. But you could use a homemade sourdough tortilla, which is what I love, or you could even use a corn tortilla and slice them into strips. I'm also going to add in some shredded cheddar cheese. Now, I know that getting pre-shredded cheddar cheese is always easier, but it is significantly cheaper to shred your own. And also, it melts and tastes better. So pre-shredded store-bought cheese has an anti-caking powder on it, and when you try to melt it, it just doesn't melt as well. So it'll definitely get the job done if that's what you have on hand, but I do encourage you, just for the quality of your food and for price, to shred your own cheese. But often what I like to do is pre-shred my cheddar cheese and then freeze it, and then I can just dump it in things as I go, which makes it really easy because I don't always feel like shredding cheese on a busy weeknight. But let's get to shredding this. One thing I feel like I should mention is that I don't often measure my ingredients, but that is especially true when I am feeling really busy. So if it's a weeknight and I'm busy, or even if it's not a weeknight, if I just have a lot going on, it's just easier to grab things and just throw it in the skillet. But the thing about that is you have to have that muscle built. You have to have experience, and you have to learn recipes to know how much of what just to throw in there. So I really can't understate how important it is to keep cooking and to learn recipes and to build those scratch cooking skills, because once you know them, you hardly have to think about it. And that really speeds the process up any night of the week. It reduces the mental load of cooking. It just saves time from having to run around and figure out what to do. And it also saves time in cleanup because if you aren't relying on a bunch of measuring cups and measuring spoons, if you're just throwing stuff in there, you don't have as many dishes to wash at the end of dinner, which is always a priority for me. And you could doctor this up as much as you want for serving. I just ate it with a dollop of Greek yogurt, which I like to use instead of sour cream. But if you have some cilantro in your garden, you could chop up some cilantro on it. You could squeeze some lime on it. I had to get a lime for another recipe, and it was only 33 cents. So that's a really cheap way to add a lot of flavor to your food. Last up on the frugal weeknight dinner menu is a really simple one pot pasta and potato dish. You could make this as a side dish or serve it as your main dish depending on your preferences. Now, using whole potatoes and chopping them yourself is definitely a more frugal option. However, if you're in a pinch, another thing that I think would work really well here are those frozen cubed potatoes. I got some recently from Azure. I think they're sold as Southern hash browns. I think that would work really well. Just dump them in and then proceed as usual. But it is, of course, cheaper to chop your own potatoes. What makes this recipe really easy is to have your ingredients prepared. I talk about this all the time on YouTube, but it is always true. So I already had celery chopped up and ready to go, and that is leftover onion from the day prior. And I had to peel and chop the potatoes and also chop a carrot, but that was really fast, and the other stuff was already done. I really can't understate how important it is to prepare ahead for weeknight meals. You might not always know what you're going to make with that stuff, but I can guarantee you at some point during the week, you can figure out what to do with some chopped onion and some chopped celery, and you will thank yourself so much later. One of my best tips for weeknight cooking is to use vegetables of a similar texture and cook them all at once. So if you're going to cook a vegetable, cook all hard vegetables. Throw in carrots and celery and onions because they cook in about the same amount of time. But if you're cooking, say, an onion and a zucchini, they cook at a different rate. Now, of course, you can always throw in that soft vegetable later in the process, but I am always trying to reduce the number of steps for busy weeknight meals. So I want all my vegetables to be able to go in at one time. But where I'm going to contradict myself is in this recipe, I need to first cook the potatoes and then add the pasta because they do cook at a different rate. So the first thing I'm doing is adding, I think it's about 3.5 cups of water to the stock pot. And in that, I'm going to add the potatoes. Now, don't bring that water to a boil first. It works better when you cook potatoes to let the water and the potatoes come to a boil together so that way they cook evenly. I'm using water here because I don't have any chicken broth. You could use boxed chicken broth if you have it or homemade chicken broth. Of course, if frugality is the goal, then I recommend using a homemade chicken broth or water. In fact, one of the best bangs for your buck, I think, is to make a homemade bone broth anytime you roast a chicken or you have chicken bones. Just throw them in a pot with some water and veggie scraps and make yourself a broth. But I don't have any chicken broth right now, so water it is. So the reason I recommend bringing them to a boil together is because when you put the potatoes in a pot of boiling water, the outsides of the potatoes cook before the inside. And so it starts to dissolve and you have this mushy exterior of the potato and then a hard interior. So bringing them to a boil together will make it cook evenly. Once you can pierce the potato with the fork, it's time to add in the pasta. And I'm throwing in about a bag of pasta. I love one pot meals with pasta because they're just really easy and they're always delicious. Who doesn't like pasta? But it can be a little tricky sometimes to figure out how much water to add. So in general, you would add 8 ounces of liquid for every 4 ounces of pasta. I eyeball this. I make sure that the pasta is mostly covered with liquid but not submerged. And then as needed, I add in a little bit more water. So as that liquid reduces down, I taste a noodle and then I add, I'd say about 1/2 cup more liquid as needed until that pasta is cooked through. I'm sure you could be more precise with it, but that's just how I do it. And then I'm just simply cooking it until the noodles are done, seasoning it with salt, pepper. I threw in a little bit of pre-shredded Parmesan cheese because I couldn't get any block of Parmesan cheese. That's all I could get at the store. And then a little bit of Italian seasoning. and a splash of white wine vinegar. And this was delicious. I ate a bowl of this as a meal itself. And then for dinner, I served this with some Instant Pot barbecue chicken thighs. And it's really good. It's really versatile. You could throw whatever you want on here and make a full meal with it or enjoy it on its own. For more recipes and tips just like this, be sure to sign up for the email list. When you do, I'll send you links to all my recipes, videos, tutorials, blog posts, and more directly to your inbox. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.